Imagine standing at the edge of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. The year is 1912, and the wind is hitting you at over 100 miles per hour, a sound so violent it doesn't resemble wind at all. It sounds like the earth itself is screaming. The temperature has dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and the cold doesn't just touch your skin, it enters you. It works its way through every layer of wool and leather, past muscle and into bone, and it stays there, a deep, burning cold that most human beings have never experienced and never will. The horizon in every direction is white. Not the soft white of a winter morning back home, not the peaceful white of snow falling gently on a quiet street. This white is absolute. It is merciless. It stretches so far and so flat and so endlessly in every direction that your eyes begin to lose their ability to measure distance, and after a while, you can no longer tell where the ice ends and the sky begins. You are standing on a continent that does not want you here. And somewhere out there, buried beneath the surface of this frozen apocalypse, is something the world was not yet ready to understand. This is Antarctica. And what humanity was about to discover here would change everything. But before we get to the discoveries that eventually made this continent one of the most protected and restricted places on Earth, we need to go back further. Much further. We need to go back to a time before any human being had ever laid eyes on this place, back to when Antarctica existed only as a theory, a ghost on the edge of maps, a place that ancient philosophers and medieval cartographers had imagined but never seen. For centuries, geographers and theorists believed there had to be a great landmass at the southern end of the Earth. The ancient Greeks reasoned that since there was land in the north, symmetry demanded land in the south. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Medieval maps depicted it as a vast continent connected to the southern tips of Africa and South America, a massive hypothetical territory drawn with confident lines despite being entirely imagined. Sailors who ventured south reported strange phenomena, colder waters, unusual currents, massive floating mountains of ice drifting northward from somewhere unknown. The world was convinced something was down there. They just had no idea what. The first confirmed sightings of Antarctica are a matter of historical debate, and if you're the kind of person who loves those debates, and if you love history told the way it deserves to be told, then make sure you subscribe to this channel, because we go deep on stories like this every single week. Now, back to the ice. In January of 1820, 3 separate expeditions from 3 different nations all came within sight of the Antarctic continent within days of each other, and historians have argued ever since about who deserves the credit. The Russian expedition led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, the British expedition under Edward Bransfield, and the American sealing captain Nathaniel Palmer all approached the continent nearly simultaneously. Bellingshausen's logs record sighting an ice shore on January 27, 1820. Bransfield had recorded land just days earlier. Palmer would arrive in November of that same year and explore further along the coast. Each nation would spend the next 2 centuries quietly insisting their man got there first. But getting there first and understanding what you had found were 2 very different things. These early sailors were not scientists. They were navigators, hunters, and merchants who had pushed their wooden ships through terrifying seas in search of seals and whales. They saw the continent. They noted it. And then they turned around, because nothing about it invited them to stay. The seas surrounding Antarctica, what we now call the Southern Ocean, were unlike anything these men had encountered anywhere else on the planet. Waves could reach 30 meters in height. Icebergs the size of cathedrals drifted silently through the fog. Storms arrived with almost no warning and lasted for days. Ships were crushed. Men were lost. The continent sat behind this wall of furious ocean like something deliberately guarded, something that had arranged its own defenses to keep the outside world away. It would take another 7 decades before a human being actually set foot on the Antarctic continent. And when they did, the race to understand this place, and eventually to claim it, exploit it, and ultimately protect it, began in earnest. The first confirmed landing on the Antarctic continent is generally credited to the crew of a Norwegian vessel called the Antarctic, commanded by Henrik Bull, who stepped ashore at Cape Adare on January 24, 1895. It was a brief, almost anticlimactic moment after centuries of myth and imagination. They stepped onto the rocky shore, looked around at the penguins and the ice, collected a few specimens, and left. But that footstep opened a door that would never fully close again. What followed was one of the most dramatic periods of exploration in human history, a period we now call the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, and if that phrase doesn't already send a chill through you, well, the stories certainly will. Between 1897 and 1922, expedition after expedition set out for the bottom of the world, each one driven by national pride, scientific curiosity, and a very human hunger to stand where no one had ever stood before. The Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897, led by Adrien de Gerlache, became the first to overwinter in Antarctica, though not entirely by choice. Their ship, the Belgica, became trapped in pack ice in the Bellingshausen Sea and drifted helplessly for 13 months. The crew suffered from scurvy, depression, and what we would today recognize as severe psychological trauma. 2 men lost their sanity entirely. The ship's doctor, a young American named Frederick Cook, kept the crew alive through sheer force of will and creative thinking, including the controversial decision to force the men to eat raw seal meat, which, as it turned out, contained the vitamin C that prevented the rest of them from dying of scurvy. They survived. Barely. And when the Belgica finally broke free of the ice, it carried back not just scientific data, but something more important, a first-hand account of what surviving an Antarctic winter actually meant. Make sure you stay with us on this, because we're about to get to the discoveries that triggered international alarm, and eventually the treaties and restrictions that still govern Antarctica today. The expeditions kept coming. Britain's Discovery Expedition of 1901, led by Robert Falcon Scott, pushed further into the continent than anyone before. Scott's team made groundbreaking observations about Antarctic geology, meteorology, and biology. They discovered that Antarctica was not just a floating mass of ice, it was a continent. An actual landmass beneath all that ice, ancient and vast, with mountain ranges and valleys and geological formations that spoke of a very different world hundreds of millions of years in the past. And this was where the first truly staggering revelation began to take shape. The rocks that Scott and his scientists collected from Antarctica contained fossils. Not ocean fossils. Not creatures of the sea. They found fossils of plants, tropical plants. Specifically, they found Glossopteris, a type of fern that had grown in warm, lush forests in Antarctica. The implications were almost impossible to absorb. This place, this monument to cold and desolation, had once been covered in forests. Once been warm. Once been alive in the way that jungles and savannas are alive. The continent had not always been at the bottom of the world, locked in ice. Something extraordinary had happened to it across deep geological time, something that science would spend the next century trying to fully understand. But there were more immediate dramas playing out on the surface of the ice, dramas of the most human kind, dramas of ambition and rivalry and, ultimately, tragedy. The race to the South Pole became the defining story of Antarctic exploration, and it ended in one of history's most heartbreaking moments. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and his carefully prepared team reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, planting Norway's flag at the bottom of the Earth after a meticulously planned and brilliantly executed journey. They used sled dogs. They rationed food with military precision. They knew the terrain from careful study. And they arrived at the pole, turned around, and came home alive. Robert Falcon Scott arrived at the South Pole 34 days later, on January 17, 1912, only to find Amundsen's flag already there. That flag, that small piece of Norwegian fabric, represented one of the most devastating disappointments in the history of exploration. Scott wrote in his diary, "The pole. Yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected." He and his 4 companions, Wilson, Oates, Bowers, and Evans, began the 800-mile return journey exhausted, heartbroken, and already dangerously behind schedule. They never made it back. Lawrence Oates, suffering terribly from frostbite, walked out of the tent into a blizzard and said the words that have echoed through history ever since, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He never returned. Scott and the remaining 2 men died in their tent just 11 miles from a supply depot that could have saved them. They were found 8 months later, their sleeping bags drawn up around them, their diaries beside them. Scott's last diary entry, written as he lay dying, read, "For God's sake, look after our people." The world was moved in a way it rarely is by a story of failure. And Antarctica, already a place of awe and mystery, became something else entirely. It became sacred. A place where human beings had suffered and sacrificed and died in the pursuit of knowledge and glory. That weight would never fully leave it. If you're still watching this story unfold, you already understand why Antarctica is unlike anywhere else on Earth, and we haven't even gotten to the part that changed international law forever. Keep watching. The scientific revelations continued to accumulate through the early 20th century, and each one added new dimensions to the world's understanding of what Antarctica was and why it mattered. Expeditions led by Douglas Mawson of Australia, Ernest Shackleton of Britain, and Richard Byrd of the United States pushed scientific understanding further and further. Mawson's expeditions in the 1910s and 1920s conducted extraordinary geological and meteorological research and revealed just how brutal the continent's interior truly was. At one point, Mawson himself survived a journey that should have killed him 3 times over, hauling himself across the ice alone, his skin peeling away in sheets, subsisting on the liver of his sled dogs, which, unknown to him, was poisoning him with lethal levels of vitamin A. He survived. He shouldn't have. And the scientific data he brought back was invaluable. Richard Byrd's expeditions in the late 1920s and 1930s introduced aviation to Antarctica for the first time, allowing aerial mapping of enormous portions of the continent's interior. What those early flights revealed was staggering in scale: mountain ranges longer than the Alps, ice sheets that stretched for thousands of miles, a continent roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined, buried under ice that in some places reached 4 kilometers in depth. Antarctica wasn't just large. It was incomprehensibly large. And beneath all that ice, the scientists were beginning to realize, was something of extraordinary global importance. The ice itself was the discovery. Or rather, what was locked inside the ice was the discovery. Antarctic ice, researchers came to understand, is not just frozen water. It is a record. An archive. A library written in frozen layers going back hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer of ice preserves air bubbles from the atmosphere of its time, containing samples of gases, particles, and chemicals from the era in which that snow fell. By drilling into the ice and extracting cores, long cylinders of frozen history, scientists could essentially read the atmospheric conditions of the ancient past. They could measure carbon dioxide levels from 400,000 years ago. They could identify volcanic eruptions, industrial pollution, shifts in global temperature. The Antarctic ice cores became one of the most powerful scientific tools in human history, providing direct evidence of how the Earth's climate had changed over geological time, and how human activity was beginning to alter it. This was no longer just an adventure story. This was not just about flags and frostbite and the glory of being first. Antarctica had become something indispensable to the entire project of understanding our planet and our future. And that understanding arrived at precisely the same moment that the geopolitical situation surrounding Antarctica was becoming dangerously complicated. By the mid-20th century, 7 nations, Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom, had each made formal territorial claims to portions of Antarctica, and several of those claims overlapped, creating the potential for serious international conflict. Argentina and Chile, in particular, had claims that directly contradicted those of Britain, and tensions occasionally flared into confrontations that stopped just short of violence. The possibility of Antarctica becoming a theater of military competition, a southern Cold War battlefield where major powers might establish bases, conduct weapons tests, or extract resources, was not theoretical. It was real. And it was growing more real with every passing year. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958 changed everything. 12 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, then locked in the most intense phase of their Cold War rivalry, agreed to coordinate scientific research across the globe, with Antarctica as a centerpiece of the program. 67 scientific stations were established across the continent. Thousands of researchers worked side by side across national lines, sharing data, sharing meals, sharing the extraordinary hardship of Antarctic existence. Something happened in that shared suffering that diplomats in warm offices might never have managed on their own. A genuine spirit of scientific cooperation emerged from the ice. The scientists returned home with a consensus. Antarctica was too important, too scientifically irreplaceable, and too environmentally fragile to be divided among competing nations. The territorial claims, the military ambitions, the resource extraction proposals, all of it needed to stop, or at least be put on hold. And remarkably, the world agreed. On December 1, 1959, the original 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty in Washington, D.C. It was one of the most extraordinary international agreements in history. The treaty declared Antarctica a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. It froze all territorial claims, neither confirming nor denying any of the existing assertions, removing the possibility of conflict over ownership. It prohibited any military activity, any nuclear testing, any nuclear waste disposal on the continent. It guaranteed freedom of scientific research and required nations to share their findings openly. It established a system of mutual inspection, allowing any signatory nation to inspect any other nation's Antarctic bases and activities at any time. In an era defined by nuclear standoffs and ideological warfare, the Antarctic Treaty was a miracle of pragmatism. 12 nations, including the two superpowers who were at that very moment threatening each other with annihilation, had agreed that at least one place on Earth would be kept outside the logic of competition and conquest. At least one place would be preserved for knowledge rather than power. The treaty has since been expanded and strengthened. The 1964 Agreed Measures for the Conservation of Antarctic Fauna and Flora began the process of formal environmental protection. The 1972 Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals extended protection to the very animal populations that had drawn the first exploiters to the Southern Ocean a century and a half earlier. The 1980 Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources addressed the ecosystem of the surrounding ocean. And then, in 1991, came the most powerful extension of all, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, also known as the Madrid Protocol. The Madrid Protocol was triggered by a crisis. In the late 1980s, serious negotiations had begun over a possible convention on the regulation of Antarctic mineral resource activities, a treaty that would have opened Antarctica to regulated mining. The prospect alarmed scientists, environmentalists, and ultimately governments around the world. The Antarctic ice cores had already demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that the continent's frozen record of climate history was irreplaceable. The idea of industrial activity disrupting that record, or worse, triggering environmental cascades in a part of the world whose ice sheets contained enough water to raise global sea levels by nearly 60 meters if they melted, was suddenly and viscerally terrifying. France and Australia led the charge against mineral extraction. Their governments withdrew from the Minerals Convention and proposed a comprehensive environmental protocol instead. The political momentum built quickly. Nations that had once eyed Antarctica's resources with interest now recognized that the risks, both scientific and environmental, were too great. On October 4, 1991, the Madrid Protocol was signed. It designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science, the same language as the original treaty, but now with enforcement teeth, and imposed a 50-year moratorium on all commercial mineral extraction. Mining was, in practical terms, banned. Antarctica had become, officially and legally, one of the most protected places on the planet. But protection is not the same as being sealed off. And this is where it's important to be precise about what restricted actually means in the context of Antarctica, because the story is sometimes misunderstood. Antarctica is not a forbidden zone in the sense of a place where entry is illegal. Scientists from dozens of nations work there every year, and a growing number of tourists visit the Antarctic Peninsula annually under strictly regulated conditions. What is restricted, what is effectively forbidden, is exploitation. Commercial extraction of resources, unregulated tourism that could damage ecosystems, military activity, nuclear testing, these are the things that the treaty system has placed outside the bounds of what is permitted on the continent. The distinction matters because it reflects something important about why Antarctica ended up the way it did. It wasn't just that the world decided to keep people out. It was that the world decided to keep certain human behaviors out, specifically the behaviors that had driven human beings to the edge of every other wilderness on Earth and left it diminished. The sealing industry had already come close to wiping out Antarctic fur seals entirely by the early 19th century. The whaling industry had devastated whale populations across the Southern Ocean throughout the 20th century. The pattern was familiar and dispiriting: humans arrive, humans extract, wilderness collapses. Antarctica was where the world tried, perhaps for the first time in a serious and legally binding way, to break that pattern before it reached its conclusion. The scientific work has continued and deepened with every passing decade. Ice cores drilled at Vostok Station by Russian scientists, and later at Dome C by an international team, have now extended the climate record back nearly 1 million years, revealing with extraordinary precision how the Earth's atmosphere has shifted through multiple ice ages and warming periods. The data locked in that ice has become foundational to modern climate science and to the global conversation about human-caused climate change. Without Antarctica, without the decision to protect it, that record would be at risk. The continent has also yielded other remarkable discoveries. Subglacial lakes, enormous bodies of liquid water trapped beneath kilometers of ice, kept liquid by geothermal heat and the insulating pressure of ice above, have been discovered beneath the Antarctic surface. Lake Vostok, the largest, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario and has been isolated from the surface world for an estimated 25 million years. The life forms discovered within it, bacteria that have survived in complete darkness, under crushing pressure, without contact with the surface atmosphere for millions of years, have expanded our understanding of where life can exist and, by extension, where it might exist elsewhere in the universe. Scientists studying Antarctic extremophiles have directly informed the search for life on Jupiter's moon Europa and Saturn's moon Enceladus, both of which harbor liquid oceans beneath their icy crusts. Antarctica, the place that appeared to be nothing, an empty, dead, frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world, has turned out to be one of the most scientifically productive environments on the planet. Every year of continued research there yields new understanding, not just of the ice or the continent beneath it, but of the atmosphere, the ocean, the history of life on Earth, and the potential for life beyond it. And all of it, every discovery, every ice core, every subglacial revelation, rests on the foundation of that 1959 treaty signed in Washington by 12 nations who chose, in the middle of the Cold War, to agree that some things matter more than politics. The explorers of the heroic age could not have imagined this outcome. Scott and Amundsen, racing across the ice for the glory of their nations, were not thinking about international environmental law. Mawson, dragging himself across the polar plateau on frostbitten feet, was not imagining that his work would eventually contribute to a treaty signed by over 50 nations. Shackleton, his ship crushed by ice, his men stranded for months on Elephant Island while he sailed an open boat through the most dangerous seas on Earth to bring rescue, was not thinking about subglacial lakes or the search for extraterrestrial life. They were just trying to survive. They were just trying to understand. They were doing what human beings have always done when confronted with the unknown, moving toward it, even when every rational instinct screamed to turn back. But their suffering, their discoveries, their deaths, and their returns all contributed to a growing human awareness of what Antarctica was. And that awareness, building across a century of exploration and scientific revelation, eventually produced something that no single expedition, no single nation, and no single moment of discovery could have produced alone: a collective decision that this place was worth protecting. That the last great wilderness on Earth deserved to remain wild. That the frozen archive at the bottom of the world was too precious, too irreplaceable, and too important to the future of all humanity to be consumed by the appetites of any part of it. Antarctica was never truly forbidden. It was, in the end, entrusted. Entrusted to science. Entrusted to international cooperation. entrusted to the idea, radical in its simplicity, revolutionary in its implications, that not everything on Earth needs to be owned, exploited, or conquered to have value. The wind is still screaming down there. The ice is still moving, glacially, inexorably, carrying its million-year memory toward a future we are only beginning to understand. The penguins still gather on the shores of the Ross Sea, indifferent to borders and treaties and the strange warm-blooded creatures who visit occasionally and then leave. The aurora australis still blazes across the winter sky in curtains of green and violet, lighting the darkness over an empty continent that has seen everything and forgotten nothing. Antarctica is not forbidden. It is waiting. Patient as only ice can be. Keeping its record. Holding its secrets. And reminding us, in the coldest possible terms, that the Earth was here long before we arrived, and will be here long after we are gone, unless we finally learn to treat it as the treasure it has always been. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why history matters and why the natural world deserves our deepest respect and protection, please leave a like on this video. It makes an enormous difference to this channel and helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to keep exploring the moments that shaped our world, subscribe right now so you don't miss a single one. We'll see you in the next chapter.